going to be talking about IPA administration. So if you guys have seen any of my other webinars or presentations, you know that I like to talk about IPA. So this one's a little bit different. A lot of my other sessions have been on development and some best practices and the various features and things like that within Designer. Now I'm going to take a little bit of a look at the back end because there's some things that have been added over the past couple of years to help us administer IPA. So looking at all that metadata that gets generated just through your normal processing, as you know, you've written a lot more processes and all of that. So that's what we're going to dive into a little bit. Yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that, and we'll answer them as we go along. All right, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeremy Stoltzfus. I'm a senior technical consultant with RPI, bringing over 15 years of loss and technical experience. I've been developing and working with process flow and then into process automation for over 10 years now. So started probably back in 2007 with the original process flow tool. Went through migration that the client that I worked for at the time, and now I've done that migration a couple of times for various clients into process automation. And just a side little tidbit for fun, I like to run these 30-hour road races. You may think that's crazy, but they are 12-person relay teams, and they're usually about 200 miles. So yeah, just a little side note. And don't tell our marketing people, but my last presentation was done at, yes, I am on Strava, JK Stoltzfus. My last session ended at 3 o'clock, so I went out and got a quick 2-mile run in between that session ending and this one starting. So there we go. All right, so just a little bit of what we're going to talk about today. So I want to go into just touch base on some tuning things because, you know, IPA tuning is always a hot topic, always getting asked a lot of questions on efficiency and making sure the flows are built in a way that, you know, they run fast. But I also want to go into, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the back end of some things that you can do to your processes to make them run a little bit quicker, make your overall system performance a little bit faster. Talk about some built-in notifications. So we've got a lot of process flows running in our production environments, and you know, I've worked with clients that have well over 100 different process flows running for various different things. So we'll talk about some ways you can be notified and kind of customize that without a lot of setup or legwork. And then we'll talk about some data cleanup. So there's a lot of you've got the main work unit table, right? But then you've got all those child tables that are just populated with tons of data as those processes are running. Especially think about some of your bigger interface flows that are processing large files with tens of thousands of records in them. So we'll talk about some options that are available to you. So first off, I want to look at the process definition screen itself, and I know this is a little bit hard to see, but you can double click on one of the panes and it'll maximize the one if you want to do that for the presentation. But looking at this is, so when you upload a process flow, of course, this is, it gets put into the database. This is the what I think of as kind of an overlooked screen because there's a lot of stuff in here. So your developers just kind of upload the flow using the designer tool, and then they don't think about coming out here to maybe do some fine tuning or look at the new features that have been added over the years to this. So we're gonna touch base on basically each one of these bullet points that I have here, some things to consider, and we'll just kind of on how you can use some of this to tune your system a little bit better. And again, this is process by process. So you can set these parameters for each specific process that you upload. First off, log levels. So this is a big one that hopefully everybody knows, but just like to remind people, you've got 4 logging level options. And I've put what I generally see and what I generally recommend as far as what logging levels to set for what type of processing. So none is if it's a simple interface, you know it runs seamlessly, you never have to go back and look at a log and troubleshoot it because it's fairly simple, straightforward, doesn't cause you a lot of problems. You're going to get the best performance when there's absolutely no logging turned on. So again, helpful for large interfaces when you're processing tens of thousands of files. So then the next one is work unit only. I generally will turn this on for some interface flows, or if I'm troubleshooting a flow. It really just depends. You do see a difference in performance between none and work unit only. So it really just kind of depends on what type of thing it is. I personally like to leave it on work unit only if I can, because if I ever do have to go back and look at something, I have that log that's already there. Activity only, I've never, so when you're looking at a work unit, there's the activity tab that shows step-by-step every activity that has executed in the life of your flow. I've never had a need to really just turn on activity only, but I have gone to the work unit and activity logging. More helpful for when you're developing your flow and debugging your flow and you're not as concerned with performance. Very rarely do I use the work unit and activity logging in a production environment. Sometimes I'll turn it on for some simple approval flows, but generally not something that I do. And especially if you've got a data loop in your flow where you're looping through like a large file or querying lots of data out of the system. When you have both of these things turned on, and this would apply to activity logging as well, it's going to be a significant performance hit. So we go from least expensive to most expensive on the logging levels. Something that's overlooked is the log buffer size. So how quickly does IPA flush that log data out to disk? So this is something that I think it defaults to 10,000 bytes, but you can set it a little bit higher. So what this means is, so until there's enough activity, 10,000 bytes in your log, it won't get flushed and you can't look at it while the process is running. You have to kind of consider a little bit of a threshold. All of that, if you set that too high, right, you've got that's all building up in memory, so you have to consider your memory usage. Now, if you're cloud, multi-tenant, it's not as much of a concern, but if you're on-premise with your landmark, you do need to make sure your IPA nodes can handle, in your grid can handle that type of volume. But then if you make that buffer size too big, think about when that threshold does get reached, when it is reached, and how much effort it has to take to flush all that data out the disk then at that point. So definitely some playing around. I think we've done some experimenting and seemed like around, like I said, the default is set to 10,000. I think we've kind of bumped some things up to 50,000 sometimes and seen some performance gains from that as well. One thing that's out here, so there's the process definition, notify by email. When you select one of the options, and I don't have the drop-down box, but it's in the top half of the screen here. The options are here: none, on completion, on failure, always, and then on failure or activity. You get this extra tab that pops up. And remember, this is process by process. So if you have a process that runs and it's for an HR business process, let's say, or some sort of payroll thing that's running, it's a scheduled flow, it runs, or maybe it's triggered from a file channel or something like that. And you can either code into the process flow a notification to be sent out, or you can, because the user needs to know when that flow completes so that they can do their next step in the business process. So you can either code that into the process flow itself, or you can, at the process definition, you can specify on completion, and then you can define the email right here, what you want the content of that to be. Now, it doesn't pull in necessarily all the data from that process flow that when it ran, but it does at least give that quick, hey, here's a FYI that this process is done running. And the other thing a lot of us do is set up process flows that I've seen a lot of clients do. They set up process flows to periodically go out and check for failed process flows. Same thing here. There's an option to just automatically send an email notification when a process does fail. So just some options here that's built in that you don't have to code into your process flow, or if you're not using configuration variables for your email addresses, just something that you can set without having to change the code or your version of your process flow. I see a question, is the log buffer size something that we configure in a multi-tenant environment? Yes, absolutely. So that is all of these screenshots. Where'd it go? Oh, here. All of these screenshots that I'm showing you, so log buffer size is right here. These are all from a multi-tenant environment. Another thing that is highly overlooked is this cancel check frequency. This was something new that was added a year or two ago. I can't remember exactly. So think about you as an administrator. You're looking at a list of work units. Hey, there's a problem with that work unit because it's been running 6 hours. I want to cancel it. What the system used to do is after every single node executed, it would check to see if the work unit had been canceled. And that's now, with this option, that's the immediate option. Now it's set to intermittent by default. And I believe the default is 10 seconds. So it will wait 10 seconds before it checks to see if the work unit has been canceled. So if you've got work units that are never canceled, you can actually bump that number of seconds up higher, and then it's not going to be, it's one less thing that it's doing during the execution of your process. And something fairly new, I'm not sure when this popped up, but when I was putting this together, I found it, is error limit before termination. So basically you can specify, hey, if I reach 100 errors in this process flow, I just want it to stop and fail. Because there's something seriously wrong with it, and I don't want it to just continue to error out and spit out those error messages. Because I don't know if you realized, but when you encounter errors, it starts writing activity logging then for those nodes that fail. So if you've got an interface flow that for whatever reason the transactions are failing or something like that, and it's repeated, that's going to add significant amount of time to that. It's not going to be the same amount of time as if the transactions actually just went through. So this is kind of something, a little bit of a threshold that you can put in. And again, this may be something that you tweak over time, right? So you notice that, hey, we've got these flows that run and they're generally pretty good, but when there's a problem, and maybe it's an interface flow, and maybe it's writing directly to or reading something out and writing to another source or something like that, you see those error messages start, or maybe it's bad data in the file or something like that. You can quickly identify that and have it just fail automatically after it reaches that threshold. And then if you've got the process definition set up to email on failure, you'll of course get notified as soon as that failure happens. And then it's not consuming one of your threads that's available on your server to execute processes. This activity limiter has been around for a little while, but it's something that's not used. I've only ever looked into it with one client, and again, it was dealing with an interface flow. So this is actually enabling, like, counting the number of nodes that execute in your process. So if you're building a flow and it's maybe your file is too big and you know that it's a problem. You know that, hey, this file should only have at most 10,000 records in it, or at most 5,000 records. And you've seen some things. I was working with one client where we had seen there was an issue with the way the file was being generated, and nobody caught it, and a particular process was running for a couple of days and just wasn't really actually doing anything. But again, it was consuming one of those threads. This activity limiter basically says, okay, you have to do a little bit of figuring out, like how many nodes are within my loop and how many activities are going to be executed. But you can set those limits. So the soft limit basically sends a warning, and then you get a hard limit as well, which a hard limit, when it reaches that hard limit, if that's turned on, it will fail the process flow again. And again, if you have that hard failure, if you have that notify on failure turned on, that will send an email notification right away. I see the question about the email on failure. What screen was that? That is on the main process definition screen. So on when you're going in, navigating through process server administrator configuration, process definition, and you go into one of your processes where you see the versions and all of that. It's on that main screen. Touch on this, and then we'll get into a little bit more, as this is a perfect transition as we go into the next part of it. So this is still on the process definition screen, but we've got this work unit data cleanup option. So the prune work unit data, you've got none, immediate, and scheduled. And if you select scheduled, you'll see an additional box pop up, and that's the days to retain before pruning. So what that means is, on successful completion, if you set that scheduled and set it to, say, 30 days, after 30 days, when that work unit completes successfully, or it was canceled, the system will automatically go and prune all of the data that's part of the processing, so the stuff that's needed for processing. Immediate is just what it is. So the moment that process flow fails, the moment that process flow completes or is canceled, it would immediately prune all that extraneous data. So what data is it? So these are the business classes that get pruned. It's important to note that none of this data is your metrics. So for approval history, things like that, so that information will remain if you choose this prune option. But you've got things like the PFI activity variable table, which I've seen systems that have been running IPA for a few years, and that table, that business class, can be upwards of tens of millions of records of data, just depending on the number of processes. This particular organization had around 100 processes, like 80 to 100 processes, and a lot were scheduled, a lot of interfaces, and so there was a lot of activity that was happening. So again, from all of this data it's just out there, it's not needed past the life of the flow, so you can have this automatic cleanup. And again, this is process by process. We're still in the process definition, so you may say, you know what, let's say our approval flows, we're going to make our standard of approval flows be 30 days, and then maybe it's interface flows or 15 days. So again, process by process, because it's on that process definition record. Moving beyond the actual process definition and then looking at a little bit more batch functionality. So here's the work unit screen, which everybody should be familiar with. In the menu, you've got these couple of options here. So you've got the schedule logs and deletion, schedule move to work unit history, schedule non-UA for user action, work unit deletion, and schedule work unit deletion. I know the whole deletion thing scares people at times, but again, think about your interface flows. Do I really need those work units hung out there for 10 years after a daily interface runs, or 5 years, or whatever it is? Maybe your organization has a retention policy. I know I've worked with some organizations that do have actual like data retention policies, and so this is just part of that, where they're cleaning that data up, and that can include approval data. Again, because they say, hey, our retention policy is this, and that's what we're abiding by, and so they make this a part of that as well. So we'll go through each of these options here. So first of all, why do we want to do some work unit cleanup? So we're minimizing the amount of data related to work unit processing. So remember I said that work unit activity variables table I've seen in the tens of millions of records already, just because of the sheer volume of activity that's happening in the system. So you're going to improve your performance of your IPA system in general, your workflows that are scheduled, that are running. And it'll allow you to go through that. Allow your running work units to go faster. It applies to completed or canceled work units only. So I see the question about immediate and the process fails. Does it still prune? No. If there is a failure, it will not do that. It's only completed or canceled work units when those automatic actions apply. And Keynote, like I said before, does not remove your approval metrics. So if you want to go back and find your approval history, that's all there with the pruning and the cleanup. When we talk about log activities and deletion, logs and activities deletion, remember I said that you've got that activities tab, which if you've got your activity logging turned on, that's one record for every single activity node that executes. So if you're in a loop, each time through the loop, all of the activities within that loop all get logged into that. So again, after that work unit completes, is that information really necessary? The logs, again, maybe you can say, yeah, clearly after 30 days, we don't need that activity because we're not troubleshooting. I know I generally don't dig into logs unless there's an issue with the process. And generally they're found right away. So sometimes we have to go back, but again, it's infrequent, and so you just kind of have to define what makes sense for you as an organization, how much data, how much of this metadata you're actually generating based on the number of flows and things like that. And even in a multi-tenant world, if you're curious, you can always run the DB count utility from the administration console page to see some of those tables, some of those business classes, and how big they are getting. If you've been running for a while, then you can kind of get a sense of what that looks like, and maybe capture that data on a periodic, maybe once a month for a few months, and see how much that data is growing, to really kind of help you analyze how your strategy is and your approach is for doing all this cleanup. So you have a couple of options here. When you schedule this. You're deleting it gives you what you want to delete. So the work unit logs and activity logs, you're deleting the actual activities and activity variables, and then deleting the work unit variables. You can select the date range, or you can set a number of completion days prior to the current date, and you can give actually work unit number range. So again, this is a job that you can run once or schedule, and it'll kick it off and prune or clean up that data. I see a question about possible to have different retention times for different processes or services. And yes, if you set the cleanup activity at the process definition itself, each one of those can have its own retention time for that. When we look at some of the other options here, you can actually, now this one doesn't have it, but we look at the next one here, moving work unit to history. This is where you can actually specify a specific process or service definition and move it to history. So again, moving a work unit to history, it doesn't actually move it to a different table or a business class, But what it does do is it flips a flag on the record, and then there's an index on that table on that active flag. And again, it's all to help with performance. But here, like I said, you can schedule that by process or service. So again, your interface flows, you know what those processes are. You can schedule all your processes to just move out to history, because you don't need them after 30 days. You never, especially like your daily interfaces. So maybe your monthly interfaces you keep for 3 months. But again, you're scheduling this by process, specific process name, for moving those over to history. And like I said, this just cleans it up from your live view. So when you go into that main work unit screen, because you're monitoring things and troubleshooting, it's less data that gets pulled into that live view screen. So think about when you're searching on a, I'm thinking GHR. One thing that I commonly get asked to look for is, hey, I thought I initiated an action for this employee, and they give me the employee number, or maybe they give me the name. And so you can search for that in the work unit title. But if you've got hundreds of thousands or even millions of work units in your system, to do that wildcard text search takes a long time. If that's all moved to history, it's out of your search, and it makes your searches faster. So just a general performance gain, and gives you a better experience. When we talk about work unit deletion, we've got two options. So we've got the non-user action work units, and again, these are your interface flows, or I know a lot of organizations write various process flows to do notifications based on data conditions. So those types of things where just clean them up. You don't need them. You don't ever go back and look at that history, so you can schedule this. You can run this to say, hey, any non-user action work units older than 90 days, just get rid of. I don't care. I don't want them. Or you can specify. You can go again by any work unit at this point, then, and then now you can go down specific to the process or service name. So again, if you have a specific interface flow that you want to just clean up, you can go ahead and do that. This, it gives you that option. Again, looking at the begin date, end date ranges, work unit ranges as well. And then you've got, so if you start moving a bunch of stuff to history, and now you've got a lot of stuff out in history, you can run these same cleanup options within the history. So you go in to look at the work unit history, and all of that information is there for you, or all those activity jobs are there for you as well, to run and do that logs and deletions. So you didn't do it on the live, but you moved everything to history. Now you can, after another period of time, you can clean up that information. And again, the non-user action work units and work unit deletions, that can all be cleared out of history as well once it's been moved over to history. I kind of talked through this a little bit, but just again, kind of what I've seen employed, kind of some recommendations and what kind of makes sense, like looking at your approval flows. You can prune them and move them to history after a certain point in time. Again, pruning, remember, does not get rid of your approval data. It just gets rid of the unnecessary metadata that's generated during the life of the flow, and generally isn't used or referred to after that flow is successfully completed. And again, key note is the pruning only acts on completed or canceled work units. Again, for your interface flows, again, prune and move to history is always an option. And then maybe some of these you even want to delete after a certain period of time. Again, your interface flows can sometimes generate a lot more data, especially if you've got a lot of variable assignments that are happening in there, and you're not utilizing JavaScript to do that within your flows. Those can really build up a lot of data, and so pruning that out, or even just deleting those records, because again, I've got a daily interface flow that churns through a couple hundred records or a couple thousand records for whatever it is. Maybe it's a GL interface or an invoice interface or something like that. And do you really need that 3 years from now? You really need all that data. So again, just consideration. And then same with notification flows. You know, I've written a ton of notification flows. The biggest one that I get commonly asked for is, hey, I need to know when I've got expiring licenses and certifications. And I want to know 30, 60, 90 days out and those types of things. After those run, the emails get sent. You know, after 6 months, you need to have that history there. Maybe, maybe not, but again, just some things to consider, some things that I've seen at various clients and, you know, discussions with various clients and how they want to implement some cleanup policies around their working at data. One of the things where this really, and I'm not sure where everyone's at as far as their, you know, are they on premise with Landmark, still single tenant cloud, multi-tenant, you know, one of the things that I went through at one point was server migration, and so we moved some data, and there was some of these working at tables were huge. Like I said, tens of millions of records, and it just took a long time to do some of those activities. And so we did employ a cleanup strategy before we, as part of that project, to make sure that everything got cleaned up and to make sure our actual migration event could go as quickly as possible. So there you go, some real life scenarios. So that's it that I had for the discussion today. Are there any other questions? And if not, hopefully we'll see you all at the Happy Hour Game Show at 5 o'clock. And just a reminder to everyone, we do have our PI Tech Talks every Friday. So just various technical, various topics. A lot of focus has been on multi-tenant for sure lately, but we've got some application-specific things as well. We're always looking for topic suggestions for those as well. So if you've got ideas, please let us know, and we can take a look at that. So I've got one question that popped in. Any way to quickly remove processing user actions that are very old? So is that meaning work units where they're stuck in somebody's in basket and they are just not doing anything, and you don't really care to have them resolved or do anything with them? Okay, so I have gone through, I've done something similar at one point, and I think I've done some spreadsheet designer queries pulling the start date down, or maybe even joined in like the activity date when that gets assigned to that user for approval. And so done some spreadsheet queries and then essentially done a cancel action upload with spreadsheet designer once I got my data correct and knew where, knew that the data that was listed in my spreadsheet was actually what I wanted to clean up. But yeah, then you can just run a spreadsheet designer upload and using the cancel action on the PFI work unit business